On the morning of Sunday, October 23rd, 1921, the entire town of Millbrook, Massachusetts woke to the sound of church bells ringing in a pattern no one had ever heard before. Not the joyful call to morning mass that had echoed through the maple-lined streets every Sunday for 15 years, but a slow, deliberate toll, the kind reserved for announcing death. Margaret O'Sullivan dropped the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir her children's porridge. Dr. Thomas Whitmore paused while shaving, soap still clinging to half his face. Sheriff Robert Hayes set down his coffee cup so hard it cracked against the saucer. Across Millbrook, 3,000 souls felt the same chill of wrongness settle in their stomachs. Because Father Gabriel Santos had never missed a Sunday Mass. Not during the influenza pandemic of 1918, when he'd administered last rites to 47 souls in a single week. Not during the blizzard of 1919, when snowdrifts reached the church windows. Not even the Sunday after he'd collapsed from exhaustion during the mill workers' strike, when he'd insisted on celebrating Mass from a chair because, as he'd whispered to Margaret, the sheep need their shepherd, especially when the wolves are circling. But this morning, as the October wind sent golden leaves spiraling past the Gothic windows of St. Patrick's Church, Father Gabriel Santos was not standing at the altar in his pristine white vestments. He was not offering the host with those small, careful hands that had blessed babies and buried grandparents. He was not gazing out at his flock with those gentle brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to the soul. Instead, Father Gabriel Santos was sitting in the confessional, still wearing the simple black cassock from Saturday evening, with a letter in his lap and tears streaming down a face that 3,000 people loved but had never truly known. Because the man they called Father Gabriel Santos, the priest who had saved their souls and mended their hearts for 15 years, was not a man at all. And the letter in his trembling hands was not from Rome, as the townspeople would later speculate. It was from Brazil, and it began with 4 words that would change everything. We know who you are. To understand how completely Father Gabriel Santos had woven himself into the fabric of Millbrook, you must first understand Millbrook itself. Picture a town of 3,000 souls nestled in the Berkshire Hills, where the Housatonic River curves like a protective arm around neighborhoods of white clapboard houses and tree-lined streets that still bear the names of the founding families: Whitmore Avenue, Sullivan Street, Morrison Road. In 1921, Millbrook was a town still healing. The Great War had taken 43 of its sons, leaving behind widows who wore black longer than fashion dictated, and children who would never know their fathers' voices. The influenza pandemic had claimed another 60 souls, including Father Michael O'Connor, the Irish priest who had shepherded St. Patrick's Parish for 22 years until consumption took him in the winter of 1906. That's when Father Gabriel Santos had arrived, like an answer to desperate prayers. He came in March of 1907, when the last snow was melting and the town was beginning to believe spring might actually come. He stepped off the afternoon train with a single leather satchel, wearing a black cassock that had seen better days,
and carrying papers from the Diocese of Boston that proclaimed him ordained in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and assigned to fill the vacancy at St. Patrick's. Bishop Flanagan himself had written to the parish council, "Father Santos comes highly recommended. His theological knowledge is exceptional, his devotion unquestionable, and his desire to serve the immigrant communities of New England makes him ideally suited for Millbrook's diverse congregation." The townspeople gathered that first Sunday with the curiosity reserved for new arrivals and the skepticism earned by previous disappointments. What they found was a man, or so they believed, of perhaps 30 years, with gentle brown eyes, soft-spoken manners, and hands that moved with the practiced grace of someone born to comfort the suffering. Father Gabriel's English carried the musical accent of his homeland, softening hard consonants and extending vowels in ways that made even ordinary words sound like poetry. When he spoke of God's love, it was with the warmth of someone who had felt it personally. When he offered comfort to the grieving, it was with the understanding of someone who had known loss. But it was the little things that made the townspeople love him. The way he remembered every child's name after meeting them once. How he always asked Margaret O'Sullivan about her youngest son Timothy's weak lungs and brought special herbal teas from his own garden. The patience he showed with old Henrik Anderson, who was going deaf but refused to admit it, sitting closer during confession so the old man wouldn't have to shout his sins. Father Gabriel never seemed to eat enough. Margaret, who had become his unofficial housekeeper within 6 months of his arrival, constantly worried about his thin frame. "You're nothing but skin and bones, Father," she would scold, setting down plates of beef stew and fresh bread that often went half-finished.
"The Lord provides what I need, Margaret," he would reply in that gentle voice, though she noticed he had particular fondness for her apple pie and the delicate finger sandwiches she made for church socials. He was odd in the way that celibate men often are, never quite comfortable with the rough camaraderie of the mill workers, never joining the men for fishing trips or card games at Murphy's Tavern. But his oddities were easily explained. He was foreign, educated, devoted to God. Such men were expected to be different. Dr. Whitmore found Father Gabriel's knowledge of medicinal herbs remarkably extensive. During the influenza outbreak, the priest had prepared remedies that seemed to ease suffering when proper medicine was scarce. "Must have learned from the mission doctors in Brazil," Whitmore had mused to his wife. "Never seen a clergyman with such understanding of women's ailments." The women of the parish adored him with the fierce protectiveness usually reserved for favored sons. Mrs. Henderson always made sure his vestments were perfectly pressed. The Kowalski sisters took turns bringing him meals. Even the Protestant ladies of the town spoke of him with respect, a rarity in a community still divided along religious lines. "He's different from other priests," Mary Sullivan had confided to her sister-in-law. "When I told him about the troubles with Patrick drinking, he understood in a way that went deeper than just scripture, like he knew what it felt like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. And perhaps that's why it worked so perfectly for so long. Father Gabriel Santos offered exactly what the people of Millbrook needed: unconditional love without judgment, wisdom without condescension, and hope without false promises. He never spoke of his own struggles, his own past, his own fears. He was simply there,
constant as the sunrise, reliable as the changing seasons. Every morning at 6, he could be seen walking the streets of Millbrook, breviary in hand, nodding to the mill workers heading for the early shift. Every evening at sunset, he tended the small garden behind the rectory, growing vegetables that somehow always found their way to families struggling to make ends meet. For 15 years, this routine never varied. For 15 years, the people of Millbrook slept peacefully, knowing that Father Gabriel Santos was watching over them, praying for them, carrying their burdens as surely as Christ had carried the cross. They never questioned why he sometimes disappeared for days at a time, claiming spiritual retreats in the wilderness. They never wondered why he never received visitors from his family in Brazil, or why he sometimes winced when lifting heavy objects, or why his hands were softer than seemed appropriate for a man who claimed to have worked on his family's coffee plantation. They saw what they needed to see, a holy man, devoted to God and to them. They had no way of knowing that every morning when Father Gabriel Santos knelt before the altar to pray, the first words from his lips were not a hymn of praise, but a whispered confession. "Forgive me, Lord, for the life I have stolen, but please let me keep serving these people who need me."
To understand how Gabriella Rodrigues became Father Gabriel Santos, we must travel back 16 years to a coffee plantation in the hills outside São Paulo, where a young woman's life was about to shatter like glass against stone. The Fazenda Rodrigues was not the largest coffee estate in the region, but it was prosperous enough to afford luxuries that marked the family as gentry: a piano in the parlor, books shipped from Paris, and an education for their only daughter that rivaled what the sons of great families received. Gabriella Rodrigues, 19 years old in the autumn of 1905, spoke Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Latin. She could calculate harvest yields, balance ledger books, and play Chopin's nocturnes with the skill of a conservatory student. But more than anything, Gabriella Rodrigues burned with a religious devotion that consumed her like fever. She had spent her childhood begging to be allowed into the chapel during morning prayers, her adolescence reading theological texts borrowed from Father Martinez at the village church, and her young womanhood dreaming of a life dedicated entirely to God. In another time, another place, another body, she might have become a priest. But in 1905, in Brazil, as a woman, the closest she could come to her calling was to become a nun, and even that required a dowry her family could not afford, not after 2 years of poor harvests and mounting debts. "You'll marry Colonel Barreto," her father had announced one October evening, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had run out of choices. "The arrangements are already made. The ceremony will be Christmas Eve." Colonel Fernando Barreto owned the largest plantation in the region, 20,000 acres of coffee trees, and the political power that came with such wealth. He was 53 years old, recently widowed, and known throughout the district for his short temper and rough hands. His first wife had died in childbirth after producing 2 stillborn sons, a tragedy that had, according to local gossip,
done nothing to improve his disposition. "I won't do it," Gabriella had said simply, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I'd rather die unmarried than marry that man."
"You'll do as you're told," her father had replied. But his eyes wouldn't meet hers. He knew what Colonel Barreto was. He knew what he was condemning his daughter to. But the alternative, losing the plantation, watching his family slide into poverty, seemed worse than sacrificing one young woman's happiness. For 2 months, Gabriella endured the preparations for a wedding she had no intention of attending. She smiled at the dressmaker's fittings, nodded politely when the colonel visited to discuss arrangements, and counted the days until she could escape. Her plan was simple. On Christmas morning, while the family was at early mass, she would take her mother's jewelry and her father's emergency money, ride to São Paulo, and disappear into the anonymity of the city. She would find work as a governess or teacher, anything that would allow her to remain unmarried and devoted to God in her own way. She never got the chance. On the night of December 23, 1905, as the household slept and Gabriella made final preparations for her escape, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom, heavy footsteps that belonged to no member of her family. The door opened without a knock. Colonel Barreto stood in the doorway, wine heavy on his breath, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. He had clearly come from the Christmas celebration at the main house, and just as clearly had decided not to wait for the wedding ceremony to claim what he considered already his. "Time we got better acquainted," he said, closing the door behind him with one thick hand while loosening his belt with the other. "You've been playing the shy maiden long enough." What happened next lasted perhaps 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes changed the course of 2 lives and shaped the next 16 years of Millbrook's history. Gabriella fought, not with the helpless struggling of a sheltered young woman, but with the desperate fury of someone who understood that her very soul was under attack. She clawed at his face, drove her knee toward his groin, bit his hand when he tried to cover her mouth. Colonel Barreto, accustomed to compliance from women and servants, was unprepared for such resistance. When she shoved him away from her, he stumbled backward, his wine-addled reflexes too slow to catch himself. His head struck the marble edge of her washstand with a sound like a melon dropping on stone. He was dead before his body hit the floor.
Gabriella stood over him for long minutes, her nightgown torn, her breath coming in short gasps, trying to understand that her life, as she knew it, was over. In 1905 Brazil, a young woman who killed a man, even in self-defense, faced a justice system that would see only her sex and his wealth. Colonel Barreto's family would demand vengeance. Her own father would disown her to save what remained of the plantation. There would be no trial, only a foregone conclusion. She did not waste time on tears or regrets. By dawn, Gabriella Rodrigues had vanished, leaving behind only a note for her parents. "I am sorry for the pain this will cause you. Please know that I had no choice. Do not look for me." What followed was 6 months of careful preparation in the shadows of São Paulo, where a young woman with money to pay for discretion could purchase new identity papers and transform herself in ways that would have been impossible in the countryside. She cut her hair short in the style of young seminarians. She practiced lowering her voice, walking with longer strides, holding her hands in the confident way of men accustomed to being taken seriously. She studied not just theology, which she already knew, but the specific rituals and requirements of priesthood, gleaned from conversations with sympathetic clerks and corrupt officials who asked no questions about why a young woman might need such information.
Most importantly, she learned about Father Francesco Benedetti, a real priest who had died of fever in the Amazon, whose death had been recorded in church documents but not widely reported. His identity, his ordination papers, his history, all could be borrowed by someone desperate enough and clever enough to make the theft work. By June of 1906, Gabriella Rodrigues no longer existed. In her place stood Gabriel Santos, 28 years old, recently ordained, seeking assignment in the missions of North America, where his gift for languages and his pastoral calling could serve the immigrant communities struggling to maintain their faith in a new land. The Bishop of Boston, overwhelmed by requests for priests to serve the growing Catholic populations of New England's mill towns, asked few questions about Father Santos's credentials. His Latin was flawless, his theological knowledge impressive, his desire to serve admirable. When word came that Father O'Connor in Millbrook had died, leaving a parish without spiritual leadership, Father Gabriel Santos seemed like a divine answer to urgent prayer. On the train from Boston to Millbrook in March of 1907, the woman who had once been Gabriella Rodrigues whispered a prayer that would become her daily ritual for the next 15 years. "Lord, I know this deception is a sin, but if you will let me serve these people, if you will let me do your work in this borrowed life, I promise to love them as you have loved me. I promise to be the priest they need, even if I can never be the woman I was born to be." The train pulled into Millbrook Station at 3:30 in the afternoon, and Father Gabriel Santos stepped onto the platform to begin a new life built on the most necessary lie ever told.
15 years of careful deception might have continued indefinitely, but in the autumn of 1921, 3 separate threads began pulling at the fabric of Father Gabriel's constructed identity, each threatening to unravel everything he had built. The first thread was João Mendoza, a Brazilian railroad worker who arrived in Millbrook in early October, carrying with him the sharp ear of someone who had grown up in the same region as the former Gabriella Rodrigues. Mendoza was running from his own troubles, gambling debts in Providence that had made certain individuals very interested in the location of his kneecaps. He'd taken work with the Boston and Maine Railroad, thinking a small town would be a perfect place to disappear for a while. But when he attended Sunday Mass at St. Patrick's, more from boredom than devotion, something about Father Gabriel's Portuguese pronunciation caught his attention. The accent was perfect, his grammar flawless, but there were tiny inflections, microscopic variations in vowel sounds that spoke of education rather than birth, of careful study rather than natural speech. After Mass, Mendoza lingered in the church, pretending to examine the stained glass windows while listening to Father Gabriel speak with parishioners. When the priest mentioned his childhood on the coffee plantation, describing the morning mist over the hills outside São Paulo, Mendoza's suspicions crystallized into certainty. He had worked those plantations. He knew that mist, and he knew that Father Gabriel Santos was describing it like someone who had read about it in books rather than lived in it for years. "Interesting sermon, Padre," Mendoza said, approaching the altar where Father Gabriel was extinguishing candles. "That story about the workers in the vineyard, it reminded me of harvest time on the fazendas near São Paulo. You know, where the Rodrigues family used to have their place, before all that terrible business with old Colonel Barreto." Father Gabriel's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the candle snuffer, but his voice remained steady. "I'm afraid I don't know that story, my son. Perhaps you could tell me about it sometime." "Oh, I'm sure you know it, Padre," Mendoza replied, his smile carrying more teeth than warmth. "Everyone in that region knows about poor Gabriella Rodrigues, the girl who killed the colonel and disappeared. They say she was very religious, very educated, spoke perfect Latin, just like a priest might." The candle snuffer clattered against the marble altar as Father Gabriel's composure finally cracked. In that moment of naked fear, Mendoza saw confirmation of every suspicion.
"Perhaps we could discuss this privately," Father Gabriel said quietly, "in the rectory, away from curious ears."
The second thread pulling at Gabriel's secret was Margaret O'Sullivan's growing awareness that something fundamental about her beloved priest didn't add up. Margaret had been keeping house for Father Gabriel for 12 years, and in that time she had noticed details that individually meant nothing, but collectively painted a troubling picture. The way Father Gabriel never used the washroom when other men were present, always finding excuses to wait until he could be alone. His knowledge of women's ailments was so precise, so personal, that it went beyond what any priest should know from hearing confessions. His hands, despite claims of farm work in his youth, were soft as a woman's, with no calluses or scars that should have marked decades of physical labor. Most troubling were the monthly disappearances. Every 4 weeks, Father Gabriel would announce a need for spiritual retreat and disappear for 3 or 4 days, returning pale and withdrawn, claiming he had been fasting and praying in the wilderness. Margaret had initially admired his devotion, but 12 years of pattern had made her suspicious. Then there were the clothes. Margaret did Father Gabriel's laundry, and she had found items that didn't belong in any priest's wardrobe. Delicate undergarments that looked distinctly feminine, hidden in the bottom of his trunk. When she'd asked about them, he'd stammered something about hair shirts and mortification of the flesh, but the explanation felt rehearsed, desperate. The discovery that finally shattered Margaret's faith in her priest's identity came on October 15, 1921, while cleaning Father Gabriel's bedroom. A letter had fallen behind the heavy wooden dresser, apparently lost during some long-ago cleaning. Margaret's initial intention was simply to return it, but the envelope was addressed to Ms. G. Rodrigues in feminine handwriting, and curiosity overcame propriety. The letter, dated July 1906, was from someone named Madre Superiora Isabel, writing from a convent in Rio de Janeiro. "My dearest Gabriella, I pray this letter finds you safely arrived in your new life. Remember that God sees the truth of our hearts, not the roles we are forced to play in this world. Your courage in choosing service over safety honors the Christ who also lived as an outcast. May you find peace in your calling, whatever form it takes." Margaret read the letter 3 times before understanding began to dawn. Then she sat on Father Gabriel's narrow bed and wept, not from disappointment or betrayal, but from a sudden, overwhelming comprehension of the sacrifice this woman had made to serve God and the people she loved.
The third and most dangerous thread was Detective Salvatore Romano, a private investigator hired by the Barreto family to finally locate the woman who had murdered their patriarch 16 years earlier. Romano was methodical, patient, and very good at his job.
He had spent over a decade following cold trails across South America and into North America, always one step behind his quarry, but never close enough to catch her. His breakthrough had come 6 months earlier, when a contact in the Boston Immigration Office had provided him with a list of every Brazilian who had entered Massachusetts between 1906 and 1910. The list included one Gabriella Santos, a priest assigned to Millbrook, whose arrival date coincided almost perfectly with Gabriella Rodrigues' disappearance from Brazil. Romano had spent weeks in Millbrook, posing as a traveling salesman while observing Father Gabriel from a distance. He noticed the same details that had caught Margaret's attention: the delicate hands, the careful avoidance of masculine company, the monthly absences that could easily correspond to a woman's biological needs. But Romano needed proof, not suspicions. On October 20th, 1921, he finally got it. Father Gabriel had been visiting the Kowalski family, where the youngest daughter was dying of consumption. Romano followed at a discreet distance, watching as the priest sat beside the girl's bed, holding her hand and speaking words of comfort. When the child's breathing became labored, Father Gabriel had done something that sealed Romano's certainty. He had lifted the girl's nightgown to listen to her chest, checking her breathing with the practiced expertise of someone who had personal, intimate knowledge of a woman's body. No male priest, no matter how medically trained, would have moved with such unconscious familiarity around a young girl's form. But a woman would know exactly where to listen, exactly how to position her hands, exactly what signs to look for. Romano sent his telegram to the Burrito family that night. Target located. Positive identification confirmed. Advise on next steps. The reply came 2 days later. Bring her back alive. We want justice, not martyrdom. On the morning of October 23, 1921, these three threads, Mendoza's blackmail, Margaret's dawning understanding, and Romano's closing trap, were about to intersect in the confessional of St. Patrick's Church, where a woman who had lived as a man for 15 years was finally going to tell the truth.
Father Gabriel Santos had not slept in 3 days. João Mendoza's demands for money, $500, more than the parish collected in 6 months, had made sleep impossible. Detective Romano's increasingly bold surveillance had made peace impossible, and Margaret O'Sullivan's knowing looks, full of questions she was too kind to ask aloud, had made pretense impossible. On Saturday evening, October 22nd, as the last of the afternoon confessions ended and the church fell into its familiar twilight quiet, Gabriel made a decision that had been 15 years in the making. Tomorrow, after Mass, he would gather the parish and tell them everything. Better to control the revelation than to let it destroy innocent people who had given him nothing but love. But Mendoza had other plans. Expecting someone else, Padre? The Brazilian's voice cut through the church's silence like a blade. He was standing in the center aisle, silhouetted against the colored light from the rose window, and his posture carried the confidence of a man holding all the winning cards. "The church is closed for private prayer, my son," Gabriel replied, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. "Perhaps you could return tomorrow." "Oh, I think we should talk now." Mendoza walked closer, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls.
See, I got to thinking about our conversation last week, about poor Gabriella Rodrigues and that unfortunate business with Colonel Barreto, and I realized something. Gabriel's hands, folded in his lap, began to tremble. What did you realize? I realized that someone who knew that story as well as you do, someone who could describe the Colonel's ranch, his temper, even the color of Gabriella's dress at the Christmas party, well, that someone might have been there, might have been involved, you could say. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. In that moment, Gabriel understood that the choice was no longer whether to confess to Mendoza's blackmail or to God's mercy. "What do you want?" Gabriel asked quietly. "Now that's more like it." Mendoza settled into the front pew with the satisfaction of a man who had just won a difficult negotiation. "I want what any reasonable man would want. Compensation for my silence. $500 like we discussed, and maybe a little ongoing consideration, if you take my meaning. And if I refuse?" Mendoza's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Well, then I might have to share my suspicions with that detective who's been asking questions around town. Nice fellow, that Romano. Very interested in Brazilian women who might be hiding in plain sight."
Gabriel closed his eyes, and for a moment he was 19 years old again, standing over Colonel Barreto's body, understanding that his life was about to change forever. The same feeling of being trapped, of having all choices stripped away, settled over him like a familiar weight. "I don't have that kind of money," Gabriel said. "Then I suggest you find it. The parish collection, the poor box, maybe some of those nice ladies who are always bringing you gifts. A man in your position has resources. You want me to steal from my parishioners? I want you to solve your problem before it becomes a bigger problem." Mendoza stood, straightening his jacket with casual menace. "You've got until tomorrow evening. After Sunday Mass seems appropriate, don't you think? Very symbolic." After Mendoza left, Gabriel sat alone in the darkening church, listening to the familiar sounds of evening settling over Millbrook. Children playing in the streets, wives calling husbands home to dinner, the whistle of the evening train carrying workers back from the mills in neighboring towns. The sounds of normal life continuing on while his world crumbled. He was still sitting there when Margaret O'Sullivan entered through the side door, carrying a covered basket that undoubtedly contained yet another meal he wouldn't be able to eat. "Father," her voice carried a gentleness that made his chest ache with unshed tears. "I saw the lights still on. Are you all right?" For 15 years, Gabriel had lied to this woman, had accepted her care, her devotion, her love, while hiding the fundamental truth of who he was. She deserved better. She deserved the truth. "Margaret," he said, not turning around, not trusting himself to meet her eyes, "if you discovered something about me, something that changed everything you thought you knew, would you still be able to forgive me?" Margaret set down her basket and moved closer, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. "Father Gabriel Santos is the kindest, most devoted priest I've ever known. He has baptized my children, buried my husband, and held my hand through every crisis of faith I've ever faced. If that man is built on lies,
then they're the most truthful lies ever told." Gabriel felt the last of his defenses crumble. In the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows, with this woman who had loved him without knowing who he really was, he finally spoke the words that had been trapped in his throat for 16 years. "My name is Gabriella Rodrigues Santos. I am 36 years old. I was born on a coffee plantation outside Sao Paulo, Brazil. I killed a man who tried to rape me, and I have been running from that truth ever since. I became Father Gabriel Santos because it was the only way I could serve God as I felt called to serve. And I have loved this parish and everyone in it with every fiber of my being." Margaret absorbed this confession with the same calm acceptance she might have shown if he'd told her he preferred tea to coffee. Then she did something that would stay with Gabriel for the rest of his life. She knelt beside his chair and took his trembling hands in hers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me with the truth." They might have stayed that way longer, but the church door opened with a sound like thunder, and Detective Romano stepped into their sanctuary, followed by Sheriff Hayes and 3 deputies. Behind them came João Mendoza, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had just cashed in his winning ticket. "Gabriella Rodrigues," Romano's voice echoed off the stone walls with the finality of judgment. "You are under arrest for the murder of Colonel Fernando Barreto. You will be extradited to Brazil to stand trial for your crimes." Gabriella, stood slowly, with the dignity that had marked every action of the past 15 years. She looked out over the empty pews where 3,000 people had sat every Sunday listening to her preach about love, forgiveness, and redemption. Then she looked at Margaret, still kneeling, still holding faith in her eyes despite everything. "Will you tell them?" Gabriella asked quietly. "Will you tell them that I never stopped being their priest, even when I stopped being Gabriel?" Margaret nodded, tears finally spilling over. "I'll tell them everything, I promise." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Gabriella whispered one final prayer, not for herself, but for the people who would wake tomorrow morning to discover that their beloved priest had been living a lie that was somehow more honest than most people's truths. The bells of St. Patrick's Church had rung strangely that morning because Margaret O'Sullivan had been pulling the ropes, trying to warn the town that their world was about to change forever. She had known somehow that this Sunday would be different from all the others. She just hadn't known how right she was. The trial of Gabriella Rodrigues Santos took place in Sao Paulo 6 months later, in a courtroom packed with journalists, curiosity seekers, and representatives from the Catholic Church who had come to witness what newspapers were calling the most scandalous case of religious fraud in Brazilian history. But something unexpected happened during those proceedings. Letter after letter arrived from Millbrook, Massachusetts, not dozens, but hundreds. Testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by Father Gabriel Santos. Descriptions of marriages saved, children comforted, souls guided back to faith by a person whose only crime had been loving them too well while wearing the wrong identity. Dr. Thomas Whitmore wrote, "In 15 years of practice, I have never known a clergyman with such intuitive understanding of human suffering. If Father Gabriel Santos was a fraud, then fraud served God better than many who claim authenticity. The mayor of Millbrook testified via written statement. During the influenza pandemic of 1918, this person worked tirelessly to save lives, showing no regard for personal safety. If that is not the work of a true priest, then I no longer understand what true priesthood means. Most powerfully, Margaret O'Sullivan made the journey to Brazil to testify in person. Standing before the judge in her simple black dress, she spoke with quiet conviction about 15 years of watching someone embody Christ's love more completely than anyone she had ever known. "Your Honor," she said, her Irish accent making the Portuguese words sound like music, "I don't know Brazilian law, and I don't know what justice looks like in your country. But I know love when I see it, and I know service when I benefit from it. Gabriella Santos, and she is Gabriella Santos no matter what name she used, served my community with a devotion that cost her everything and gave us more than we ever deserved." The defense attorney, a young idealist named Carlos Mendaña, who had taken the case without fee, built his argument around a simple premise. Gabriella Rodrigues Barreto killed Colonel Barreto in self-defense, and everything she had done since was an attempt to serve God and humanity in the only way her circumstances allowed. "My client stands accused of fraud," he told the court. "But I ask you to consider what kind of fraud produces 15 years of selfless service. What kind of deception results in hundreds of families finding hope, comfort, and spiritual guidance? What kind of lie serves truth so faithfully?"
The prosecution, led by Colonel Barreto's nephew, painted a different picture. A cold-blooded murderess who had manipulated innocent people for 16 years, living in luxury while her victim lay in the ground. But that narrative crumbled when Margaret O'Sullivan described Father Gabriel's living conditions: the sparse rectory, the simple meals, the worn cassocks that she had mended countless times because new ones were too expensive. This was not someone living in luxury, but someone who had chosen poverty in service of others. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Their verdict: not guilty of murder, guilty of identity fraud. Sentence suspended given time already served and extraordinary circumstances. But that legal verdict was only half the story. The other half was what happened when Gabriella Rodrigues Santos returned to Millbrook in the spring of 1922. She stepped off the same train where Father Gabriel Santos had arrived 15 years earlier, but this time wearing a simple blue dress instead of clerical black, her hair grown out and pinned in the style of women her age. She carried the same worn leather satchel, but now it contained not religious texts, but letters from every family in Millbrook, begging her to come home. The entire town was waiting at the station. 3,000 people had gathered, spilling out from the platform onto the surrounding streets. They had come not to judge or condemn, but to welcome back the person who had loved them faithfully for 15 years, regardless of what name that person had used or what clothes they had worn while doing so. Margaret O'Sullivan stepped forward first, and without a word, she embraced the woman who had been her priest, her confessor, and, though neither had ever dared speak it aloud, the love of her life. "Welcome home, Gabriella," she whispered, and those two words contained more acceptance than a dozen theological treatises. Dr. Whitmore was next, doffing his hat with the same respect he had always shown Father Gabriel. "The town council has voted," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "If you'll have us, we'd like you to stay. Not as our priest, the church has made their position clear on that matter, but as our friend, our neighbor, our family." Sheriff Hayes stepped forward, his badge glinting in the spring sunlight. "There are no charges against you in Massachusetts. As far as the law here is concerned, you're free to make whatever life you choose."
But it was 8-year-old Timothy O'Sullivan who broke through the crowd of adults and threw his arms around Gabriella's waist, burying his face in her dress just as he had once buried it in Father Gabriel's cassock during thunderstorms that frightened him. "I don't care what the grown-ups say about names and clothes," he announced with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "You're still the same person who told me God loves me even when I'm scared. You're still the same person who taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing what's right even when you are afraid." And perhaps that was the most profound theology anyone had spoken through the entire ordeal. The Catholic Church, faced with an impossible situation, chose the path of quiet compromise. They could not officially recognize Gabriella's years of service, but they also could not deny the evident fruits of that service. Bishop Flanagan, now an old man, issued a carefully worded statement. "The Church does not condone deception in any form. However, we acknowledge that God's grace can work through even the most irregular circumstances, and we have seen evidence of such grace in the lives touched by this ministry." Practically, this meant that St. Patrick's Church received a new priest, Father William Murphy, an earnest young man from Boston, but that Gabriella Santos was quietly allowed to continue many of her pastoral duties under the unofficial title of parish administrator. She could not celebrate Mass or perform sacraments, but she could counsel families, organize charitable works, and continue the herb garden that had provided healing to so many. More importantly, the people of Millbrook made their own choice about what mattered most. They had loved Father Gabriel Santos, not because of his ordination papers or his masculine identity, but because of his compassion, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to their welfare. Those qualities had not changed when Gabriel became Gabriella. Margaret O'Sullivan and Gabriella Santos never officially married. Such unions were impossible in 1922 Massachusetts. But they lived together in the little house behind the church, and everyone in town understood the nature of their relationship without needing legal documents to make it real. Margaret had waited 15 years to love Father Gabriel Santos honestly. She was not about to waste another day loving Gabriella Santos dishonestly.
Timothy O'Sullivan,
who had lost his father in the war and found a father figure in Father Gabriel, discovered that the love he had received was no less real for having come from someone who was not technically his father. Gabriella taught him to read Latin, helped him with his mathematics, and continued to chase away his nightmares with stories about saints who had also faced impossible choices and found ways to serve God despite them. Dr. Whitmore, freed from the professional awkwardness of discussing women's health with a male priest, found in Gabriella a medical partner whose knowledge of herbal remedies and intuitive understanding of female ailments made his practice more effective than it had ever been. Together, they established what was probably New England's first informal collaborative clinic, where scientific medicine and traditional healing worked hand in hand. As the years passed, the story of Gabriella Santos became part of Millbrook's identity. Visitors to the town would notice the unusual number of women in positions of quiet leadership, the absence of rigid gender roles that characterized other communities, and the general atmosphere of acceptance for people whose lives didn't fit conventional molds. "We learned something important from Gabriella," Margaret would tell curious outsiders. "We learned that love is more important than rules, that service matters more than status, and that sometimes the most authentic life requires living authentically rather than conventionally." Gabriella herself lived quietly, never seeking attention or recognition for the remarkable transformation she had undergone. She tended her garden, helped her neighbors, and found peace in a life that was finally completely honest. She died in 1964 at the age of 79, surrounded by 3 generations of Millbrook families whose lives she had touched. Her funeral was attended by over 1,000 people, including dozens of Catholic priests who came not in official capacity, but as individuals who recognized holiness when they encountered it, regardless of its packaging. Her headstone bears a simple inscription chosen by Margaret: Gabriella Rodrigues Santos. She loved as Christ loved, served as Christ served, and proved that God's grace is bigger than human understanding. But perhaps the most fitting memorial stands not in the cemetery, but in the continued life of Millbrook itself, where her influence can still be felt in the unusual openness, the ready acceptance of difference, and the understanding that sometimes the most profound truths come disguised as lies, and sometimes the most authentic priesthood wears no collar at all. On quiet Sunday mornings, when the light streams through the stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Church in particular ways, older residents will sometimes swear they can still hear the echo of Father Gabriel's gentle voice, speaking words that Gabriella Santos lived every day of her extraordinary life. God sees the heart, not the clothing. God knows the intention, not the convention. And God's love is so vast, so encompassing, that it can transform even our deceptions into instruments of grace.
In the end, that might be the most remarkable thing about the story of the most beloved priest in Millbrook, Massachusetts. Not that a woman successfully pretended to be a man for 15 years, but that a community successfully learned to love the person rather than the persona, the spirit rather than the form, the truth rather than the disguise. And perhaps, in learning that lesson, they came closer to understanding the heart of the gospel than many who never questioned a single doctrine or challenged a single assumption. The bells of St. Patrick's Church still ring every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship. But now they ring with a slightly different tone, not just summoning people to hear about God's love, but reminding them that they have seen it, touched it, been transformed by it, in the person of someone who proved that grace is indeed sufficient, and that love can indeed find a way, even when that way leads through the most impossible circumstances, the most necessary deceptions, and the most courageous acts of faith ever undertaken in the name of serving others. Some stories aren't forgotten because they're too small to matter. Some stories are forgotten because they're too large for comfortable memory, too challenging for easy categorization, too true for simple telling. But some stories, like some loves, are too powerful to stay buried forever. And this is one of them.